Hey guys, tonight let's all do the responsible thing and slowly power down our brains together. Dim the lights, put your phone somewhere face down, let your shoulders drop a little. You don't need to focus, you don't need to remember names. If you drift off halfway through a sentence, honestly, that's ideal. Tonight we're talking about pirates, but not the loud movie pirates with eyeliner and dramatic music. These are the quieter, messier, deeply inconvenient pirates, the ones who discovered that the most powerful legal defense in the early modern world was being pregnant. This is the story of female pirates who avoided execution by pleading the belly, which sounds dramatic but is actually just a very old, very bureaucratic way of saying, please don't hang me, I'm pregnant, and that would be awkward. So let's ease into the Caribbean. Warm air, slow waves, a legal system that technically exists, and a gallows that's always, always in use. We'll begin with two names you've probably heard whispered together like a matched set of chaos, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Of course they're a pair. History loves a duo, and the courts absolutely hated them. Anne Bonny was born sometime around 1797, which is historian speak for "we are guessing." She may have been born in Ireland, she may have been born in England. No one was writing baby books for future pirates. Her father was a lawyer, already a bad sign. He had an affair with Anne's mother, which was inconvenient, illegal, and socially exhausting. So he did what any stressed man of the 1690s would do. He dressed his illegitimate daughter as a boy and pretended she was his clerk. This works for a while. Anne grows up hot-tempered, stubborn, and entirely uninterested in behaving correctly. She allegedly stabbed a servant girl, which, again, allegedly, but no one bothered denying it very hard. Eventually, the whole family relocates to the Carolinas, because if you're running from scandal, you might as well add mosquitoes. Anne's father becomes successful. Anne becomes bored, and bored women in the 1700s were considered a serious threat to public order. She marries a sailor named James Bonny because that's how last names work, and also because nothing says romance like, I'd like to stop being my father's problem and become your problem. James Bonny turns out to be deeply unambitious. Anne hates that. She also hates that he works as an informant for the British government, so naturally she leaves him and runs off with a pirate captain named Calico Jack Rackham. Calico Jack is not a particularly good pirate. He's flashy, he's dramatic, he likes colorful clothes. He is not known for discipline or success. But Anne likes him, which is enough. She dresses as a man aboard the ship, not convincingly, but convincingly enough for the era. And this is where Mary Read floats into the story, very gently, like a tired ghost who also knows how to use a cutlass. Mary Read was also raised as a boy, which at this point is starting to feel like a trend. Her mother did this to keep receiving money from her deceased husband's family. A long story, very practical. Mary grows up wearing men's clothes, working men's jobs, and fighting in wars. She serves in the military. She falls in love with a fellow soldier. He dies. Of course he does. Mary goes back to wearing men's clothes because life is easier that way, and eventually ends up on a pirate ship because apparently that's the next logical career step. Anne and Mary meet aboard Calico Jack's ship. They become close, possibly very close. Historians argue about this endlessly, quietly, in footnotes. At some point, Anne reveals she is a woman. Mary reveals she is also a woman. Everyone pauses, then everyone goes back to looting. They fight, they swear, they drink. They are reportedly better fighters than most of the men, which the men deeply resent. And then, inevitably, the British Navy shows up because piracy is fun, but paperwork always wins. In 1720, Calico Jack's ship is captured near Jamaica. Most of the crew is drunk, because of course they are. Anne and Mary fight back. The men hide below deck. Anne allegedly shouts something along the lines of, if you'd fought like men, you wouldn't be hanged like dogs, which is not soothing language. They are all taken to trial. The men are convicted and hanged efficiently, without drama. Anne and Mary are also convicted and sentenced to death. And this is where things get gently legal. When asked if they had anything to say before sentencing, both women do the same thing. They plead the belly. They inform the court they are pregnant. The courtroom sighs. The execution pauses. Doctors are called. There is examination, which we will not linger on because this is a bedtime story. The pregnancies are confirmed because bodies do not lie, even if pirates do. Under English law, pregnant women could not be executed until after giving birth, the logic being that the unborn child had committed no crimes, which is very generous for the 1700s.
Mary Read never makes it to execution. She dies in prison, probably from fever, possibly during childbirth. Records are vague. They often are when women stop being useful to history. Anne Bonny disappears. She is not executed. She is not buried. She simply vanishes from the record. Some say her father paid for her release. Some say she remarried and lived quietly. Some say she returned to piracy. History shrugs, and honestly, that feels appropriate. Now let's gently drift away from the Caribbean, because Anne and Mary were not alone in this strategy. Pleading the belly was a known legal maneuver, not common, but known, which means other women tried it, and sometimes it worked. Take Elizabeth Lyon, also known as Edwidge, or sometimes just that pirate woman. She was part of a crew led by Edward Teach. Yes, that Blackbeard. Elizabeth was captured in 1724, tried for piracy, convicted, and sentenced to hang. She pleaded the belly. The court delayed her execution, and then the records stop. No execution date, no burial record, just silence. Another woman, Rachel Wall, tried the same thing in 1789. She claimed pregnancy to avoid hanging. Unfortunately for Rachel, she was not actually pregnant, which was awkward and very final. She was executed, and history used her as a cautionary tale, which feels unnecessary because death is usually lesson enough. The thing about pleading the belly is that it wasn't mercy, it was bureaucracy. It didn't mean forgiveness, it meant postponement. And sometimes postponement was all a woman needed, because prisons were chaotic, records were sloppy, and influential people could be bribed, or fathers could intervene, or memories could fade. Now, as we float along, notice something important. These women were not spared because they were gentle, or misunderstood, or secretly noble. They were spared because the law tripped over itself. They used the only leverage available to them, their bodies, which is bleak but also effective. Anne Bonny and Mary Read didn't plead innocence. They didn't beg forgiveness. They didn't apologize for piracy. They simply said, "You can't hang us yet." And the law said, "Fair." So let's just sit with that for a moment. The gallows waiting, the paperwork stacking up, the unborn children acting as temporary shields. History often talks about bravery in battle, but sometimes survival is quieter. Sometimes it's knowing exactly which sentence to say at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right tone. And with that calm, slightly smug thought, we'll let the waves carry us forward. In the next part, we'll drift into other women who used pregnancy, delay, and legal gray zones to escape execution, including smugglers, thieves, and one woman who absolutely tried this twice. We were floating gently away from Anne Bonny vanishing into history like a politely rebellious ghost. Now we're going to drift somewhere less salty, less dramatic, and somehow even more depressing. Because once word got around that pregnancy could delay execution, women across the English-speaking world began doing a little mental math. Rope, courtroom, doctor, pause button. And thus, pleading the belly became a strange intersection of biology and bureaucracy. This wasn't pirate-specific. It applied to thieves, smugglers, arsonists, occasional poisoners, and women who had simply annoyed the wrong people. The process was boring, which makes it perfect for us. When a woman was sentenced to death, she could claim pregnancy. A jury of matrons, actual women, would be assembled. They would examine her quietly, uncomfortably, without anesthesia or privacy. If they confirmed she was quick with child, execution was delayed, not canceled, just moved to a later calendar page. And the thing about calendars in the 1700s is that they were unreliable. Let's take a soft walk through London. It smells bad, everyone is tired, and Newgate Prison is full. This is where we meet Elizabeth Canning, not a pirate, just deeply chaotic. Elizabeth was a young servant who in 1753 claimed she had been kidnapped, robbed, and held captive. The story caused a sensation. Pamphlets were printed. Opinions were formed immediately. Then her story fell apart. Witnesses contradicted her. Timelines didn't work. Eventually, Elizabeth was charged with perjury, which at the time was punishable by death because lying was apparently worse than poverty. Elizabeth was convicted, sentenced, and she pleaded the belly. The matrons examined her and said no. Elizabeth appealed. They examined her again. This time, yes. The court sighed deeply. Execution delayed. Public opinion turned against her anyway. She was eventually transported instead of executed, which is sort of mercy, but with boats. Now let's drift north to Scotland. Cold, quiet, very judgmental. Here we find Agnes Sampson. A woman accused of witchcraft in the late 1500s faced a world where even the smallest rumor could mean death. Witches technically did not have the legal right to plead the belly, but pregnancy still complicated matters. Agnes was accused of causing storms to kill King James VI, an accusation as ambitious as it was absurd. She was tortured, confessed, recanted, and then confessed again. Rumors spread that she might be pregnant, and those rumors slowed the process. Eventually, they were dismissed, and she was executed. But the delay itself mattered, because every delay meant time, and time sometimes allowed intervention. From there, the story drifts back to the sea, not to pirates, but to smugglers. Mary Harvey, in the early 18th century, was convicted of theft on an impressive scale. She pleaded the belly, the matrons confirmed her pregnancy, and her execution was delayed. Mary gave birth in prison, her child was baptized, and then, quietly and without drama, her sentence was changed to transportation. No announcement was made, the paperwork was simply moved into a different folder. This happened more often than people realize because courts did not enjoy executing mothers, not for moral reasons, but for administrative ones. Children required records, parishes, caretakers, and oversight, while dead women were simpler. This brings us to one of the most exhausted figures in the system, the judge. Sentencing someone to death only to stop, call doctors, wait months, and reschedule was a constant frustration. Judges complained endlessly in letters and journals, quietly, like worn-down office workers. Some argued pregnancy should not matter. Others insisted the law was the law. Women learned this rhythm well. Claim pregnancy, hope it was true, hope it was visible, hope the matrons were sympathetic. Sometimes it did not even need to be true. Jane Horne tested the system harder than most. Convicted of theft and sentenced to hang, she pleaded the belly, was examined, and confirmed pregnant. Her execution was delayed. Months passed, no birth came, and she was examined again. Still pregnant, the court said. More time passed, still no child. Eventually, it became clear Jane had been faking, exaggerating, or simply deeply unlucky. She was resentenced and executed. Judges used her case as an example when they were tired of delays, yet it did not stop others from trying, because when the alternative is a rope, every option is worth attempting. Class mattered, gently but decisively. Elite women, wives of merchants or daughters of landowners, were far more likely to benefit from pleading the belly because they had advocates, families, and letters written on their behalf. Poor women had only timing,
and timing was unreliable. This is why Anne Bonny's disappearance matters. Her father was wealthy, connected, and motivated. Mary Read had none of that and died in prison. The law pretended to be neutral, but it was not. Pregnancy also changed perception. A pregnant woman was seen as softer, human, less abstract. Judges wrote about it. Clergymen preached about it, saying she carried innocence, as if the woman herself did not exist. Women understood this and leaned into it, wearing looser clothing, exaggerating symptoms, even timing crimes after conception, a grim form of family planning. Across the Atlantic, in colonial America, the same laws and gallows applied. Bathsheba Spooner, in 1890, was convicted of murdering her husband and pleaded the belly. Doctors examined her and disagreed. Some said she was pregnant, others said she was not. The court chose to execute her anyway. After her hanging, an autopsy revealed she had been pregnant, causing a brief scandal before history moved on. Bathsheba became a warning not to courts but to women. Timing had to be perfect and evidence undeniable. Pleading the belly was not clever or a loophole. It was survival in a system with no room for mercy. These women were not gaming the law, but navigating it. The law was rigid, life was not, and pregnancy interrupted certainty. It forced pauses, and pauses were dangerous in systems built on momentum. Executions were meant to be swift, public, and final, and pregnancy said wait. Sometimes waiting changed everything. As the 19th century approached, laws slowly changed, executions became rarer, and pregnancy mattered less. But for a brief window in history, a woman's body could halt the gallows, not forever or reliably, but long enough. Anne Bonny and Mary Read understood this instinctively. They did not argue philosophy or ask for forgiveness. They simply delayed, and sometimes delay was survival. From there, the focus drifts away from criminals to women who were not criminals at all, yet were still threatened with execution, exile, or ruin. In the early modern world, being a woman was already suspicious, and being pregnant in the wrong context was practically a legal event. Unmarried pregnancy in the 17th and 18th centuries was not just embarrassing, but criminal adjacent, implying fornication, moral failure, and a future burden on the parish. Poor, unmarried, pregnant women found themselves in courtrooms and jails not for crimes committed, but for crimes imagined. Susanna Cox in the early 1500s was young, poor, unmarried, and pregnant.
She was accused not of a specific crime, but of being likely to commit one, specifically infanticide, based on the logic that desperation would lead to violence. She was arrested before anything happened, gave birth in custody, and when the child lived, proving the feared crime never occurred, she remained in jail anyway because the system does not like being wrong. Pregnancy could delay execution for criminals, yet cause imprisonment for women who had done nothing. The same body produced different assumptions. In France, pregnancy did not always stop execution, especially in cases involving poisoning, heresy, or the irritation of powerful nobles. Catherine Monvoisin, known as La Voisin, a fortune-teller and midwife implicated in the affair of the poisons, was arrested, interrogated, tortured, and rumored to be pregnant. The process slowed briefly, then the authorities decided the scandal was too large to wait and executed her anyway. Other women connected to the scandal were spared, not because they were innocent, but because they were pregnant and well-connected. Again, delay plus influence meant survival. Among royalty and nobility, pregnancy mattered intensely. Queens and noblewomen were rarely executed outright, but were imprisoned, exiled, or sent to convents. When Anne Boleyn was arrested in 1536, whispers immediately spread about whether she was pregnant because execution would have been politically complicated if she were. She was not, and the axe fell as scheduled. Catherine Howard faced similar rumors and met the same fate. Margaret Pole, older and noble, was not pregnant and was executed brutally.
showing that pregnancy did not guarantee mercy, it merely forced a conversation. Conversations were dangerous in systems built on silence. Lower down the social ladder, pregnancy often turned death sentences into transportation, imprisonment, or forced labor. This was not kindness, but logistics, as pregnant bodies needed care while dead ones did not, and once a child existed, the state had to decide what to do with it. One of the strangest side effects of pleading the belly was false hope. Pregnancy did not mean safety, only delay, and delay could still end in execution. Some women gave birth, recovered, and were hanged weeks later, quietly and without crowds. Mary Wade, convicted of theft, pleaded the belly, gave birth, had her child taken, and then was hanged without scandal or outcry. The system resumed its rhythm. Still, women kept trying, because even temporary survival mattered. Pregnancy while awaiting execution was not peaceful. There were no soft beds or proper care. Women labored in cells, surrounded by strangers, sometimes in chains. Children born this way entered the world already marked as inconveniences, evidence, and problems, sent to workhouses, relatives, or disappearing entirely. Which means that pleading the belly wasn't just about the woman, it was about forcing the system to acknowledge another life, even if only briefly. When we return to pirates, we see that they understood something others didn't. Pirates lived outside the law, but they paid close attention to it. Anne Bonny and Mary Read knew exactly what to say, not emotionally, not theatrically, but legally. They didn't cry or perform remorse, they stated a fact, and that fact forced the law to pause. That pause, quiet and procedural, was powerful in its own way. As this part widens its lens, it becomes clear that pleading the belly was one of the few moments in history where a woman's reproductive state gave her leverage over the state. Not respect, not autonomy, just leverage. It was temporary, conditional, deeply unfair, yet real, and women used it not as a trick, but as survival. When the law is rigid, life looks for cracks, and pregnancy was a crack the law never fully learned to seal. So the image settles, a courtroom forced to wait, a judge tapping fingers, a sentence postponed. As time drifted forward, the world moved away from public, loud, immediate execution where pregnancy could interrupt momentum, toward a system that preferred tidiness, less spectacle, more forms. The end of pleading the belly didn't arrive with drama. It simply faded, like a custom no one formally canceled, but everyone stopped mentioning. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, governments reconsidered execution not out of kindness, but discomfort. Public hangings became unruly, crowds treated them as entertainment, riots broke out, and sympathy too often landed with the condemned. The solution wasn't mercy, but privacy. Executions moved behind walls, prisons became permanent, transportation expanded, and in this quieter system, pregnancy stopped functioning as a pause button. By the early Victorian period in England, pleading the belly still existed on paper, but had lost its force. Doctors replaced juries of matrons, medical authority replaced communal judgment, and sentiment was removed from the process. If pregnancy wasn't visible, the answer was no. If it was, the delay was shorter. After birth, execution could follow swiftly. The law learned how to wait efficiently, which was somehow worse. Transportation emerged as the new mercy. Instead of hanging women, courts shipped them elsewhere, Australia, Tasmania, anywhere distant enough to remove the problem. Pregnant women were still transported, sometimes because they were pregnant, since colonies needed people and children meant future labor. Pregnancy no longer delayed punishment. It became part of it. Women gave birth on ships, in ports, in camps. No gallows, just exile. In this shift, the power of pleading the belly quietly disappeared as the body stopped interrupting punishment and was instead absorbed by it. In France, after the Revolution, efficiency ruled. The guillotine did not care about pregnancy. Though debates and memoranda existed, political urgency outweighed concern for the unborn. Pregnant women were executed, rarely and quietly, but when they weren't, it was due to politics, optics, or race, not pregnancy. As systems modernized, drama flattened. Efficiency increased, and efficiency is not merciful. Early law was clumsy enough to allow interruption. Modern law was smooth enough to allow none. Anne Bonny existed at a precise moment, too early for efficiency, too late for chaos, when saying the right words mattered more than evidence. That window closed, and with it went one of the few tools women had. The language itself changed. Pleading the belly sounded physical and human, while modern terms like mitigating circumstances, stay of execution, and medical review removed bodies and voices. The law didn't become kinder, it became quieter, replacing public mercy with private calculation. Women lost the ability to stop time with their bodies, and the pause vanished. By this point, pleading the belly was not abolished, but irrelevant. The law learned to move forward without waiting, yet the stories lingered because they were never truly about pregnancy, they were about leverage. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are remembered not because they were pirates, but because they briefly forced the law to acknowledge them as inconvenient realities. They didn't win, they delayed, and delay in a violent system is its own form of power. Later historians, particularly Victorian men, were uncomfortable with this. They romanticized Anne Bonny into symbols, a fiery feminist, a tragic lover, an exception. But she wasn't exceptional, only observant. She saw the rules, noticed the cracks, and stepped into one. Mary Read, often reduced to novelty, was simply someone who understood timing. She didn't beg or plead innocence, she stated a condition, and the system hesitated. Pleading the belly worked because early modern justice was conflicted, trying to be moral, authoritative, and feared all at once. The unborn child didn't fit neatly into guilt or innocence, and systems hate presence without labels. Once uncertainty disappeared through medical authority and bureaucracy, the delay disappeared too. Yet the instinct to slow systems down remains. People still look for pauses, interruptions, moments where momentum must be reconsidered. Anne Bonny didn't create a loophole, she noticed one, and loopholes are simply places where rules haven't fully hardened. There is something deeply human in choosing delay over defiance. No speeches, no martyrdom, just not yet. Survival rarely looks heroic, it looks administrative. That's why these stories feel modern. The men were executed and became examples. The women delayed and became questions, and history dislikes questions. Anne Bonny's unresolved ending, no execution, no confirmed death, just continuation, feels unsatisfying precisely because it is human. Pleading the belly didn't save women because society valued them. It saved them because society didn't know what to do with them. The unborn child forced complexity into a system that preferred simplicity. And once systems learned to absorb complexity, they stopped hesitating. That is the real end of the story. Not kindness, but smoothness. Anne Bonny and Mary Read existed in the gap between cruelty and efficiency, as did every woman who stood in a courtroom and said the one thing that made everyone pause. Those pauses didn't last forever, but they mattered, because history is shaped not only by revolutions and rulers, but by delays, by adjournments, by sentences postponed just long enough for something else to happen. Sometimes survival isn't about escaping the system at all. It's about making it wait.
We're about to talk about fans. Not sports fans, not screaming fans, but the delicate, fluttery, extremely dramatic hand fans of Victorian England, and how an entire generation of women supposedly used them to flirt, gossip, and emotionally manipulate men, all while sitting 3 feet away from their parents, which is honestly impressive.
Now, before we begin, just settle in. There will be no sudden twists, no shocking scandals, just a long, gentle drift through parlors, ballrooms, and drawing rooms filled with people who desperately wanted romance but were absolutely terrified of it. The Victorian era was many things. It was polite, tightly corseted, deeply concerned with appearances, and obsessed with rules. Rules about how to walk, how to sit, how to breathe, and especially how to interact with the opposite sex. You couldn't just talk to someone you liked. That would be unthinkable. You couldn't flirt openly. That would be scandalous. And you definitely couldn't express desire directly. So instead, you fluttered. Specifically, you fluttered a fan. Fans had been around forever. Ancient Egypt, Imperial China, the Renaissance. Everyone loved a good fan. They cooled you down, made you look elegant, and gave your hands something to do when you weren't allowed to do anything else. But in Victorian society, the fan allegedly became something more, a secret language, a coded system of gestures, a way to say things you were absolutely not allowed to say out loud. And whether this language was real, exaggerated, or mostly invented later, the Victorians loved the idea of it because it made repression feel romantic. Picture a typical Victorian drawing room. The air smells faintly of tea, furniture polish, and emotional restraint. A young woman sits upright on a sofa with perfect posture, her dress doing its best to prevent blood circulation. Her mother is nearby, watching, always watching. Across the room is a young man who is polite, clean, ambitious, and deeply unsure what to do with his hands. Eye contact lasts exactly 1 second too long, and suddenly it's scandal. So instead, the fan comes out, held delicately, almost casually, but not too casually, because casualness in Victorian England was suspicious. According to popular guides of the time, or guides published slightly later claiming to describe the time, every fan movement meant something. Closing the fan slowly meant I wish to speak with you. Opening it wide meant you are handsome. Covering it with the face meant do not look at me, which usually meant please look at me, but discreetly. Dropping the fan meant we can be friends, which was Victorian for this is over. Twirling it in the left hand meant we are being watched, which frankly you always were. Touching the fan to the lips meant affection, to the heart meant devotion. Fanning slowly meant boredom. Fanning quickly meant excitement, or possibly just poor ventilation. The Victorian era loved systems, labels, and the idea that human emotion could be neatly categorized into gestures. In reality, most people probably just waved their fans around because it was hot, the dresses were heavy, and the rooms were packed with people who refused to open windows. But the myth of the fan language stuck because it offered something intoxicating: control. In a world where women had very little agency, the idea that a woman could silently communicate desire, rejection, or intrigue with the flick of her wrist was powerful, even if it wasn't always true. Victorian women were expected to be passive, quiet, pure, and blissfully ignorant of anything related to romance or sex, which is ironic because they were constantly being married off. Young women were raised to be desirable but not desiring, attractive but not aware, educated just enough to be interesting but not enough to be threatening. Courtship was slow and exhausting. A man could not simply approach a woman. Introductions had to be made, families had to approve, and reputations had to be preserved. Every glance mattered, every gesture mattered, and every accidental brush of a glove was analyzed for weeks. The fan became a socially acceptable prop, something a woman was allowed to hold, move, and use expressively. In a society that relentlessly policed female behavior, any object that gave women even the illusion of freedom became important. Fans were often ornate, made of lace, silk, ivory, or mother of pearl, painted with pastoral scenes, classical myths, or flowers that also had secret meanings, because everything had a meaning and nothing was simple. A woman might receive a fan as a gift from a relative, a suitor, or a suitor's mother, which came with its own psychological implications. Carrying a fan signaled femininity, refinement, and leisure, and it quietly marked class as well, since working-class women didn't usually have time for that nonsense. Whether young men truly memorized these fan codes is debatable. Some probably did, some thought they did, and some nodded politely while having absolutely no idea what was happening. Imagine trying to remember that touching the cheek meant one thing and touching the chin meant another, all while maintaining proper posture and pretending you weren't sweating. It was exhausting, but Victorian culture thrived on exhaustion. It loved effort, restraint, and turning basic human interaction into a multi-step ritual. For women especially, subtlety was survival. You couldn't say, "I like you," but you could open your fan slowly and hope he'd read the pamphlet. Entire books were published about the language of fans, manuals, guides, helpful little references for anyone brave enough to flirt silently. Some were serious, some playful, and many were exaggerations created later when people grew nostalgic for a more romantic past. The Victorian era loved to mythologize itself. Still, the idea spread beyond England into France, Spain, and America, turning a piece of folded fabric into a tool of emotional espionage. The quiet truth is that most Victorian women were not master manipulators orchestrating elaborate flirtations through fan choreography. They were human beings navigating suffocating social rules. Sometimes a fan movement meant something, sometimes it meant nothing, and sometimes it just meant, "Please let this conversation end." But the association of the fan with secrecy tells us something important. Victorian society was obsessed with surfaces, appearances, and what could be seen versus what must never be acknowledged. Communication slipped sideways into symbols, gestures, and objects. The fan wasn't just a flirtation device, it was a coping mechanism, a way to exist in public without fully revealing oneself. Flirting rarely happened in private because private was dangerous. Private led to opinions, rumors, and social ruin. Instead, everything happened in semi-public spaces, drawing rooms, parlors, ballrooms, filled with furniture, chaperones, and judgment. Parlors were arranged like polite obstacle courses, with chairs spaced to prevent closeness and tables positioned to block direct paths. Somewhere, an older relative always sat strategically, pretending not to listen. Victorian parents mastered selective blindness, ignoring obvious misery for years, but noticing a single glance instantly. Young women learned to communicate without being obvious, without leaning forward, speaking too freely, or doing anything later described as bold. The fan thrived in this environment. A woman could sit perfectly still, her back straight, ankles crossed properly, face neutral, while her hand moved freely. The fan allowed motion in a culture that restricted motion, and parents rarely objected because fans were respectable, ladylike, and expected. No Victorian courtship discussion is complete without chaperones, usually older women, mothers, aunts, widowed relatives, or anyone with enough authority to glare. They supervised interactions, ensured propriety, and prevented enthusiasm. They sat nearby, listened closely, and interrupted conversations with comments about the weather. Yet emotions still happened, and women had to get creative. A slight fan movement could indicate interest, a quick flick could signal annoyance, and holding it closed tightly could mean restraint, irritation, or nothing at all. That ambiguity was part of the appeal. Because if confronted, everything could be denied. Someone could always say, "Oh, I was simply warm," or "I was adjusting my grip," or "I didn't realize I did that." Plausible deniability was the backbone of Victorian romance. Men weren't entirely clueless. Some were very aware of these subtle cues, especially those who spent enough time in polite society to recognize patterns. But many men were also, let's say, optimistic. A woman fanned herself slightly faster than usual. Was she excited to see him, or was the room stuffy? She closed her fan slowly. Was that an invitation, or just the end of a breeze? Victorian men often interpreted gestures the way modern people interpret text messages, overthinking, second-guessing, reading into everything. This created a strange emotional economy where women were expected to be subtle, men were expected to pursue, and neither side was allowed to be too direct. So everyone just circled each other slowly, like anxious planets. Here's where the romance gently peels back. Not all women enjoyed this system. For some, the fan language, real or imagined, was empowering, a way to exert control and choose. For others, it was exhausting. Imagine having to monitor every movement, every gesture, every unconscious habit. A fan slip could be misinterpreted, a nervous flick could spark gossip, and once gossip started, it rarely stopped. Victorian society was deeply invested in female reputation. A woman's perceived purity determined her future, marriage prospects, social standing, even financial security. Subtle communication was risky, yet silence was worse, because women were expected to marry, to attract interest, to be chosen, but never eagerly. So fans existed in an uncomfortable middle space, encouraging just enough and discouraging just enough, all under watchful eyes. Ballrooms were slightly different. Larger spaces, more movement, more noise, but nothing was truly private. Dancing was one of the few socially acceptable ways for men and women to interact physically, briefly and formally, with rules. Hands touched but only gloved, bodies came close but not too close. Fans appeared here too, between dances, during pauses, while standing along the walls pretending not to watch. A woman could fan herself while glancing sideways. A man could approach cautiously, hoping the fan didn't close too sharply. And if it did, well, message received. Victorian culture didn't allow emotional honesty. Feelings were supposed to be controlled, contained, managed, but humans are inconveniently emotional, so everything leaked out sideways. Into letters written carefully and then destroyed, into gifts chosen deliberately but described casually, into objects like fans, gloves, and flowers. Fans, being visible and dynamic, became symbolic of feminine mystery. Men wrote about them, artists painted them, poets referenced them. The fan wasn't just an accessory, it was an extension of the woman herself, which made it a target for moral commentary. Some critics worried that fans encouraged manipulation, that women used them to toy with men and lead them on. An interesting accusation considering women had very limited power in almost every other area of life. Victorian society often framed female subtlety as dangerous because it was difficult to control. A woman speaking openly could be corrected. A woman hinting silently was harder to regulate, and that made people uncomfortable. So the fan became slightly scandalous, suggestive rather than overt, a harmless object with implications. Of course, not every woman used a fan as a flirtation tool. Some just liked the breeze, some liked the fashion, some held them because everyone else did. But the myth persisted, and myths matter. They shape expectations, influence behavior, and give people scripts to follow. A young woman might not have planned to flirt, but if she believed a fan movement meant something, she might hesitate or lean into it. A young man might not have noticed her, but if he believed fans spoke, he might start listening. Slowly and quietly, behavior adapted to belief, which is how social rituals were born. As we move forward, fans reveal themselves as just one part of a much larger system of coded communication. Victorian society loved secrets, as long as they were polite. So the fan closes gently, the room grows still, and we drift onward through a world where no one said what they meant and everyone pretended that was normal. With fans set aside, something even more loaded appears: flowers. If the fan was about movement, flowers were about intention. You didn't accidentally send flowers. You chose them, arranged them, and hoped the recipient had memorized the same emotional dictionary you had. This was floriography, the language of flowers, and Victorians were obsessed. They believed every flower carried a meaning, every color mattered, and every arrangement told a story, which was convenient in a society that forbade emotional honesty. Flowers had symbolic meanings long before the Victorian era, but Victorians turned this into an emotional bureaucracy, with books, charts, guides, and entire volumes explaining what each flower meant and which combinations were acceptable. The meanings weren't universal either. One book might say a yellow rose meant friendship, another jealousy, Another, disappointment. So you could send flowers thinking you were affectionate and accidentally imply resentment, which feels very on brand. Flowers became one of the safest ways to communicate emotion. You could give them in public, explain them away as polite, and deny deeper meaning if necessary. Oh, I just thought they were pretty. For women especially, flowers were both expressive and restrictive. A woman could receive them, arrange them, press them into books, or wear them, but she wasn't supposed to talk openly about desire, so flowers spoke instead. Red roses meant love, white roses suggested purity and innocence, pink roses indicated admiration, lilies symbolized devotion, violets meant loyalty, and then there were the passive-aggressive ones. Yellow carnations implying rejection, striped carnations suggesting regret, snapdragons meaning deception. A woman might receive a bouquet and spend hours analyzing it, counting blooms, checking colors, comparing them to her guidebook, and if she didn't like the message, that was awkward. Sending flowers wasn't just about romance. They were used for friendship, mourning, apologies, and social gestures, but romance made everything complicated. A man had to be careful. Too bold risked scandal. Too mild risked being ignored. A woman had to respond appropriately. Accepting flowers could imply encouragement, rejecting them could cause offense, and accepting them too eagerly could spark gossip. Again, everything existed in a delicate balance. Flowers appeared in public spaces, on tables, in vases, pinned to dresses, and like fans, they became part of the visual language of courtship. A woman wearing a particular flower might be signaling something, or she might just like the color, and everyone around her would speculate endlessly. This is where fans and flowers quietly intersect. Imagine a young woman holding a fan, a bouquet nearby, her gestures subtle and expressions controlled. She fans herself slowly. There's a rose at her side. Is she bored, affectionate, or just warm? Victorian courtship thrived on this ambiguity. It allowed romance without responsibility, where nothing had to be said out loud and nothing had to be committed to too early. It sounds charming until you realize how emotionally draining it was. Women were expected to decode constant messages, men were expected to send them, and mistakes were costly. A misunderstood flower could lead to embarrassment, a misread fan gesture to heartbreak, and yet people kept doing it because direct communication was considered improper. Floriography, like the language of fans, was likely exaggerated over time. Some Victorians took it very seriously, others probably just enjoyed the idea, and publishers certainly enjoyed it. Flower dictionaries sold well, made excellent gifts, and reinforced the belief that emotions should be expressed indirectly. Emotions were dangerous, passion was destabilizing, restraint was virtuous. So, if you had feelings, you disguised them as gardening. For women, this created a strange double standard. They were expected to be expressive enough to attract interest, but restrained enough to remain respectable. Flowers helped navigate that line. A woman could accept them graciously, arrange them beautifully, even dry them and keep them, but she couldn't openly reciprocate desire. So she might send flowers in return, carefully chosen, neutral but suggestive, perhaps a rosebud instead of a full bloom. Maybe a violet tucked into a letter. Everything measured, everything cautious. And just like with fans, deniability was key. If questioned, it was all innocent, all tasteful, all misunderstood. Now, as much as this all sounds poetic, we shouldn't romanticize it too much. Victorian courtship was stressful, it was slow, it was rigid. Many people married not for love, but for stability, for family approval, for financial security. And all these coded gestures existed within that reality. Flowers could soften the process, but they couldn't change it. Still, the idea of flower language persists today. We still associate roses with love, lilies with mourning, daisies with innocence. The Victorians didn't invent these meanings, but they certainly organized them obsessively. And in doing so, they gave people another way to feel without speaking. Now, as we gently drift onward, we begin to see how all these systems, fans, flowers, glances, gestures, worked together, a complex choreography of restraint, a dance of implication. And at the center of it all, women navigating a world that watched their every move. So let's float onward, past the bouquets, past the pressed petals, because next we talk about gloves and how something designed to cover hands became a surprisingly intimate object. No dramatic endings, no big reveals, just a slow settling of everything we've been circling around. We've talked about fans, we've talked about flowers, now we talk about gloves, which sounds boring and is boring, but also oddly intimate. Victorian gloves were everywhere. You wore them outdoors, you wore them indoors, you wore them at parties, at church, at visits, at walks. Bare hands were personal, almost too personal. A woman's hands were considered delicate, suggestive, capable of implying labor, desire, or independence, none of which were encouraged. So gloves covered them. Thin ones, thick ones, leather, cotton, lace. And just like everything else, gloves became part of the unspoken language. Removing a glove was not casual. It meant something. A woman might remove one glove to shake hands, just one, the other stayed on, which meant that a handshake could feel momentous. Skin touching skin briefly, a rare sensation in a culture that avoided it. Men noticed this, they absolutely noticed this. And because gloves were removable, they introduced a whole new set of interpretations. A glove dropped accidentally could be picked up, returned, held for a moment too long. Sound familiar? Yes, it's the fan all over again, but softer. Giving someone a glove was personal, very personal. It was an object that had touched your skin, that carried your shape, your warmth, which is why gloves appear in so many romantic stories of the era. They weren't just accessories, they were proxies. And once again, women had plausible deniability. Oh, I must have dropped it. Oh, how clumsy of me. Victorian romance ran on accidents. Now, here's the important part. Fans, flowers, gloves, none of these things worked in isolation. They formed a whole ecosystem of implication. A woman might receive flowers. A man might watch how she arranged them. She might fan herself when he entered the room. She might remove a glove when speaking to him. None of these gestures guaranteed anything, but together they built a narrative, and that narrative could stretch on for months, even years. Courtship was slow, painfully slow. Letters were written carefully, meetings were supervised, conversations were polite to the point of numbness, and yet people fell in love anyway, quietly, anxiously, often with very little certainty. Which is why these coded languages mattered. They gave people hope, hope that a glance meant something, that a fan movement was intentional, that a flower choice was thoughtful. Hope is powerful, especially when options are limited. But here's the part that's often left out of the romantic retellings. These systems were not equal. Men generally had more freedom. They could speak more directly, they could initiate, they could recover socially from mistakes. Women couldn't. A woman misjudging a signal could damage her reputation. A woman appearing too eager could be labeled improper. A woman appearing too cold could be dismissed entirely. So subtlety was not just romantic, it was protective. Fans weren't just flirtation tools, they were shields. Flowers weren't just messages, they were buffers. Gloves weren't just accessories, they were boundaries. And Victorian women learned to live inside these boundaries, to express themselves without crossing lines, to be interesting without being dangerous. Now, modern culture loves to romanticize this, to imagine a world of elegance and mystery, but living inside constant restraint is tiring. Every movement monitored, every gesture interpreted. It's not surprising that by the late Victorian period, people began to push back. Courtship became slightly more relaxed. Social rules loosened just a bit. Women began to claim more space, more voice. Fans didn't disappear, flowers didn't vanish, gloves didn't stop being worn, but their emotional weight shifted. They became less necessary as translators. And today, when we look back, we often project intention onto every detail. We imagine women orchestrating elaborate flutations through perfectly executed fan choreography. The reality was likely messier. Sometimes a fan meant interest, sometimes it meant heat, sometimes it meant nerves. Sometimes flowers were symbolic, sometimes they were just available. Sometimes a glove drop was intentional, sometimes it wasn't. And that's okay, because the real story here isn't about decoding gestures perfectly. It's about people trying to connect in a world that discouraged connection, trying to feel seen without being exposed, trying to choose without being obvious. Victorian society prized control, control of bodies, control of emotions, control of reputation, and when control is tight, expression finds cracks. Fans fluttered in those cracks, flowers bloomed in them, gloves slipped through, not because Victorians were more romantic than we are, but because they had fewer options. And maybe that's why these stories linger. They remind us that even in the most restrictive environments, people find ways to communicate, quiet ways, imperfect ways, not always effective, not always understood, but human. So when we talk about the secret language of Victorian fans, what we're really talking about is the human need to be known, to be chosen, to be acknowledged, even if you can only do is flick your wrist slightly and hope someone notices. And that's where this story gently settles. The kind of job that only exists because everyone involved agreed not to think about it too hard. Tonight, we're talking about the resurrection men. Not zombies, not vampires, just very tired 19th century men with shovels, questionable morals, and an excellent understanding of supply and demand. This is not a horror story. There will be no screaming, no dramatic chase scenes, just a long look at damp graveyards, polite doctors, and a society that desperately needed corpses but absolutely did not want to know where they came from. We begin with the problem no one wanted to solve out loud. By the early 1800s, medicine had a deeply awkward situation. Doctors wanted to learn anatomy properly. Surgeons wanted to stop guessing where organs were located. Medical schools were appearing everywhere, full of young men who had paid good money to look intelligent while holding scalpels. All of them needed bodies, real human bodies, preferably intact, recently deceased, and ideally not missed too much. Unfortunately, the law had opinions. In Britain and much of Europe, dissection was deeply uncomfortable for polite society. Cutting open a human corpse was seen as degrading, shameful, something done to criminals and not to respectable relatives. The only legal cadavers available for medical study were executed criminals, murderers, thieves, and the occasional unlucky soul who annoyed the crown too loudly. This worked if you were running a very small medical school, but by the late 18th century, executions were declining. Morally, this was a success. Anatomically, it was a disaster. Medical students kept enrolling, doctors kept teaching. The bodies simply did not arrive. So everyone did what humans often do in this situation. They pretended it wasn't their fault and outsourced the problem to people who did not ask questions. This is where the resurrection men entered the story. They were not officially hired, legally recognized, or mentioned in polite conversation, but everyone knew. These men specialized in a very specific task, digging up freshly buried bodies. They did not usually steal jewelry. They did not bother with coffins. They wanted the body itself, and they wanted it quickly before decay set in and professors started complaining. Grave robbing existed in a strange legal gray area. Stealing property was illegal, but a corpse was not technically property. It belonged to no one, which meant it was, legally speaking, just lying there. This loophole carried the entire system. Resurrection men worked quietly, operating at night and targeting new graves, usually within a day or two of burial. They dug just enough to break into the coffin, crack it open, and extract the body. Efficiency mattered. They often left the coffin, clothing, and personal items behind. Taking valuables made it an obvious crime. Taking only the body kept things ambiguously wrong. The body would be wrapped, loaded into a sack, and transported to a medical school, where a porter would pretend not to notice anything unusual about the delivery. Payment was made in cash, no receipts, no questions. Everyone involved told themselves a comforting story. Doctors claimed they were advancing science. Students claimed they were learning to save lives. Resurrection men claimed they were providing a service. Families claimed their loved ones were resting peacefully. As rumors spread, the public grew tense. Graveyards stopped feeling like places of mourning and began to resemble unsecured warehouses full of valuable inventory. Families adapted. Iron coffins appeared, heavy, expensive, impractical, but effective. Some graves were guarded by watchmen hired to sit overnight with lanterns and clubs. Mort safes were installed, large iron cages bolted over graves to keep bodies in place until decomposition made them undesirable. Once a body decayed too much, resurrection men lost interest. This was a business, and quality mattered. In poorer neighborhoods, none of these defenses were realistic. Iron coffins cost money. Watchmen needed wages. Mort safes required infrastructure. Resurrection men focused where resistance was lowest: the poor, the unclaimed, the forgotten, orphans, workhouse residents, and those whose funerals were rushed and quiet. Public opinion did not improve. By the early 1800s, resurrection men were widely feared and hated, yet tolerated. Everyone understood what would happen if they vanished. Medical education would stall. Surgery would regress. Doctors would return to guesswork. Society complained loudly and changed nothing, until the situation escalated. Grave robbing was one thing. Murder was another. In Edinburgh during the late 1820s, two men named William Burke and William Hare identified a shortcut. Digging was labor. Waiting for funerals took time. They realized they could supply bodies directly, fresh, clean, undamaged by soil. They targeted the vulnerable: lodgers, alcoholics, people unlikely to be missed quickly. Their method was simple: suffocation. No blood, minimal marks, better prices. Doctors paid more for high-quality specimens, and Burke and Hare delivered, until they were caught. Hare testified against Burke. Burke was executed and, in a final act of historical irony, publicly dissected. The case horrified the public and shattered any remaining tolerance for the system. Parliament responded with the Anatomy Act of 1832. Medical schools were allowed to use unclaimed bodies from hospitals and workhouses, solving the supply problem by shifting the burden onto the poor. Resurrection men became unnecessary, at least officially. Some disappeared into ordinary labor. Some were arrested. A few likely continued quietly for a time. Modern anatomy exists because of these men, because of stolen bodies, because of moral compromise disguised as progress. Every anatomical diagram and surgical technique traces back to damp soil and quiet shovels. People wanted better medicine. They did not want to face the cost, so they paid others to face it for them. That is the story of the resurrection men. Most resurrection men did not work alone. This was not an individual operation, but organized teamwork. Crews usually consisted of 2 to 4 men: one to dig, one to watch, one to handle the body, and sometimes one to manage transport. Speed mattered more than strength. A skilled team could exhume a body in under an hour by digging only at the head of the grave, cracking the coffin lid, looping a rope under the arms, and pulling the body free. The coffin stayed behind. The soil was replaced. The surface was smoothed. Bodies were wrapped in sacks or sheets. Clothing was often removed to avoid legal trouble, though sometimes left depending on the buyer. Transport methods ranged from carts and wheelbarrows to 2 men carrying a sack through dark streets, pretending it was laundry or grain. Medical schools paid based on size, condition, and freshness. Adult male bodies were preferred. Women and children paid less. Diseased or deformed bodies were sometimes rejected. Prices fluctuated. In London, a good body could earn several guineas, enough to support a family for weeks, which explains why, despite the risks, the resurrection men kept working. This was one of the few ways for working-class men to earn real money quickly. Dangerous money, but money nonetheless. and danger was constant. Graveyard watchmen were paid to sit all night, sometimes armed, sometimes drunk, sometimes both. Families took turns guarding graves themselves, sons and brothers with clubs, fathers who had not slept since the funeral. Resurrection men learned to read human behavior, which guards could be bribed, which ones were alert, which ones would panic at shadows. They also learned the law. If caught with a body, they could sometimes argue it wasn't stolen. After all, it wasn't property. They hadn't taken jewelry. They hadn't broken into a house. Sometimes this worked. Sometimes the mob decided legality was less important than vibes. Crowds could be brutal. There are records of resurrection men being beaten, drowned, or left for dead by angry locals. Not always killed, just strongly discouraged. Doctors, meanwhile, maintained plausible deniability. They claimed ignorance. They claimed necessity. They claimed they asked no questions, which was mostly true, but also very convenient. Some anatomists went further. They built private receiving rooms, back entrances, special hours for deliveries. Nothing illegal, just efficient. Students were officially told nothing. Unofficially, they knew exactly what was happening. They joked about it. They bragged about rare specimens. Sleepy hypocrisy was everywhere. And then there were the cemeteries that fought back. Some graveyards installed alarm systems, primitive but effective. Tripwires attached to bells. Any disturbance triggered noise. Others added heavy stone slabs, deep graves, multiple layers of protection. This led to escalation. Resurrection men learned to cut through iron bars, to dismantle mort safes and return later, to bribe watchmen before they even started. It became a quiet arms race, technology versus desperation, and through it all, the bodies kept moving. Let's pause here for a moment, because it's easy to imagine resurrection men as monsters, shadowy villains, but most were normal, working-class men, dock workers, laborers, people who did unpleasant jobs because pleasant ones did not pay. Some drank heavily, some didn't. Some justified their work as helping science. Some didn't think about it at all. There are accounts of resurrection men who refused certain bodies. Children, people they knew, members of their own communities. Lines existed, they were just very blurry. Of course, there were also men who crossed every line. We already met Burke and Hare, but they were not alone. In London, gangs competed violently. Territory mattered. Cemeteries were claimed. Deliveries were stolen. There are stories of resurrection men robbing other resurrection men, stealing bodies mid-transport, because why dig when someone else already did the work? Medical schools did not intervene. They paid whoever arrived first. This encouraged speed, risk-taking, and sometimes mistakes. Bodies delivered too early, people who were not quite dead. This is rare, but not mythical. There are documented cases of people waking up on dissection tables, of doctors discovering signs of life too late. These incidents terrified the public because nothing undermines confidence in medicine like premature dissection. Doctors insisted these were anomalies, mistakes, unfortunate timing. The public remained unconvinced. Funerals became tense, burials were rushed, families watched until the last shovel of dirt fell, grief mixed with paranoia. And through it all, resurrection men adapted. They learned which doctors paid best, which schools asked fewer questions, which porters could be trusted. They worked on schedules. They tracked burial notices. They read newspapers obsessively. Death announcements were business leads, which is a sentence that should make you pause, but not too much. We're trying to stay relaxed. By the 1820s, the system was unsustainable. Too many bodies, too much fear, too many scandals. Burke and Hare were the breaking point, but not the beginning. Public opinion turned sharply. Medical schools were criticized openly. Doctors were accused of complicity. And, reluctantly, lawmakers noticed. This brings us back to the Anatomy Act, a piece of legislation that solved a problem while creating another. By legalizing the use of unclaimed bodies, the state removed the need for grave robbing. But it also effectively declared that poverty erased bodily autonomy after death. If you died poor and alone, your body became educational material. Families feared the workhouse more than death itself, because dying there meant disappearing completely. Resurrection men faded from the spotlight. Some vanished, some were arrested for unrelated crimes, some probably took new jobs that were marginally less illegal. Graveyards grew quieter, medical schools grew cleaner, and everyone congratulated themselves. But the ethical discomfort never really went away. Modern medicine is built on this foundation, on bodies taken without consent, on systems that valued progress over dignity. Which is not a condemnation, just an observation. History rarely offers clean solutions, just quieter ones.
So as we drift toward the next part, keep this image in mind. A foggy cemetery, a group of men working efficiently, not cruelly, not kindly, just doing a job that society pretended didn't exist. In part 3, we'll slow down even more. We'll follow the bodies into the anatomy theaters themselves, the students, the lectures, the oddly casual atmosphere of cutting into the dead. We followed the bodies from the grave to the door of the medical school, wrapped, delivered, paid for in cash that nobody officially tracked. Now let's do the slightly stranger thing. Let's walk inside. The anatomy theater was not a theater in the modern sense. No popcorn, no curtain, just a tiered room with wooden benches, a central table, and a smell that never quite went away. These rooms were designed so students could look down at a body while a lecturer talked calmly about it, very calmly, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world, which to them it sort of was. A dissection usually took place in winter, cold, slow decomposition. Summer was unpleasant. Bodies were stored in basements or cellars, sometimes submerged in alcohol or brine, sometimes just kept cold and hoped for the best. When a body was brought up, students gathered. They leaned forward, they took notes, they joked quietly. This was education, serious education, but also, inevitably, a little surreal. Most students were young men, late teens, early 20s. Some had never seen a dead body before. Their reactions varied. Some were fascinated, some were nauseated, some fainted. This happened often enough that no one made a big deal out of it. A porter would drag the student aside, someone would open a window. Class continued. The lecturer stood at the head of the table, usually male, usually confident, often dramatic in a very understated way. He would point, explain, cut. The body became an object, not a person, not a story. This emotional distance was essential. Without it, the work would be unbearable. Students were taught to suppress discomfort, to focus on structure, on function. This is the liver. This is the heart. This is what happens when things go wrong. They were not encouraged to ask who the person had been. In fact, names were rarely known. Bodies arrived anonymously, labeled with numbers, occasionally with vague details, male, female, approximate age. That was enough. There are accounts of students recognizing bodies, neighbors, former acquaintances, people from their own neighborhoods. These moments were awkward. Some students asked for reassignment, others said nothing and continued because professionalism mattered, even when professionalism meant pretending you weren't dissecting someone you'd spoken to last year. The public image of anatomy was carefully managed. Dissections were sometimes open to the public, tickets sold, a kind of educational spectacle. This helped normalize the practice, or at least distract from its origins. At the same time, rumors spread about stolen bodies, about doctors paying for corpses, about students being reckless.
Medical schools tried to reassure everyone. They emphasized science, progress, the greater good. And to be fair, progress happened. Surgeons became more precise. Anatomical knowledge improved dramatically. Operations that were once blind became slightly less blind. Patients survived more often, which helped justify everything else. Still, unease lingered. Some students collected souvenirs, bones, skulls, preserved organs. This was technically frowned upon, but rarely punished. A skull on a desk signaled seriousness, intellectual commitment, and a slightly unhinged personality. Anatomy was not just education, it was identity. Doctors distinguished themselves from barber surgeons and folk healers by their knowledge of the body's interior. Dissection was proof of legitimacy. This made bodies valuable, not emotionally, but symbolically. Each corpse was a stepping stone toward professional status. Which brings us to the student's relationship with death itself. For many, this was the first time death became abstract, not personal, not tragic, just instructional. This had lasting effects. Doctors were expected to be calm, detached, unflappable. Emotion was unprofessional. Grief was for families, not practitioners. This culture developed here, on wooden benches, around cold tables. Some students struggled with this. They wrote about nightmares, about guilt, about the feeling that the dead were watching. Others adapted quickly, too quickly, some thought. There are accounts of students eating lunch during dissection, of jokes made at inappropriate moments. These stories horrified the public, but within the schools they were seen as coping mechanisms, dark humor, emotional armor. The resurrection men, meanwhile, were rarely mentioned. Their role was deliberately erased. Bodies were said to come from legal sources, which was increasingly true after the Anatomy Act, but habits remained. Doctors avoided discussing the origins of their cadavers. Students learned not to ask. This silence was part of the system. Let's drift for a moment into the lives of the bodies themselves, not in a sentimental way, just observational. Most were poor. This is undeniable. Workhouse residents, hospital patients, people without families able to claim them. Their deaths were unremarkable. Illness, exposure, exhaustion. Their afterlives, however, were educational. They taught hundreds of students. Their organs were examined, their bones labeled. In a strange way, they became immortal, not as individuals, but as examples. And that's uncomfortable, but also true. By the mid-19th century, anatomy had become routine, respectable, regulated. The horror had faded into bureaucracy, but cultural memory lingered. Grave robbing became a cautionary tale, a symbol of scientific overreach, a reminder of what happens when demand outpaces ethics. The resurrection men became almost folkloric, characters in stories, figures of dark humor, which is often how societies cope with guilt. So as we move forward, notice how quiet everything has become. No shovels, no guards, just classrooms, lectures, notes being taken. Progress, yes, but built on silence. We'll see how this practice spread beyond Britain, how other countries handled their own corpse shortages, and how cultural attitudes shaped very different solutions. By the middle of the 19th century, the resurrection men were mostly gone, not celebrated, not forgiven, just phased out, which is how history prefers to deal with its more awkward employees. Britain wasn't alone in facing the corpse problem. It just happened to be loudest about it. Other countries had their own solutions, shaped by culture, religion, and how comfortable they were with admitting unpleasant realities. France, for example, handled things very differently. French medical schools had far fewer issues acquiring bodies because French law and culture were less squeamish about dissection. Hospitals supplied corpses more openly. Unclaimed dead were routinely used for medical education. There was less secrecy, less pretending, which meant fewer grave robbers and fewer riots. Germany followed a similar path: strong state control, clear regulations, bodies moved through official channels. This didn't make the practice morally clean, it just made it quieter. In the United States, things were chaotic, which will surprise no one. Early American medical schools struggled badly with body supply. Grave robbing was common, especially in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. And here, the social fault lines were even sharper. In America, resurrection men disproportionately targeted black cemeteries and poor immigrant communities, Irish neighborhoods, African American burial grounds. Bodies were taken because resistance was less likely, and if resistance did happen, it was often ignored. This led to riots. In 1788, the Doctors' Riot in New York erupted after medical students were accused of waving severed limbs at children from anatomy lab windows, which is not a great public relations strategy. The mob stormed hospitals, doctors fled, bodies were exhumed and reburied by force. The message was clear: people were willing to tolerate science, they were not willing to tolerate disrespect. Eventually, American states passed their own anatomy laws, modeled loosely on Britain's, legalizing the use of unclaimed bodies. Again, the burden fell on the poor. By the late 19th century, the system stabilized. Medical education became standardized. Cadavers were acquired through official channels. Consent, however, was still rare. The idea that someone might choose to donate their body to science was not yet widespread. Death was still something families guarded closely. The past, meanwhile, faded into rumor. Resurrection men became exaggerated villains, hunched figures with lanterns and evil grins, not tired laborers doing a job nobody else wanted. This simplification made it easier to forget the complicity of respectable institutions. Doctors were recast as heroes of progress, students as earnest learners. The bodies themselves became invisible. But the legacy lingered in subtle ways. Medical ethics evolved slowly, always playing catch-up. Informed consent, respect for remains, donor programs. All of these concepts emerged because earlier systems were so obviously uncomfortable. Modern anatomy labs are clean, bright, quiet. Bodies arrive with paperwork, with permission, with carefully chosen language. Donor, not corpse, not specimen. This shift matters. It's an attempt to acknowledge humanity where earlier generations avoided it. Still, if you follow the thread back far enough, it always leads to the same place: a graveyard, a shovel, a society that wanted progress without confrontation. The resurrection men were not aberrations, they were symptoms. They existed because demand existed. They thrived because laws lagged behind reality. And when they became too visible, they were removed not by moral awakening, but by administrative reform, which is a very human solution. Today, we look back with a mix of fascination and discomfort. We tell these stories as curiosities, as dark footnotes, but they are foundational. Every anatomy textbook, every surgical breakthrough, every calmly confident doctor explaining how the body works, all of it rests in part on stolen bodies. That doesn't mean medicine is bad. It means progress is messy. It means history is rarely neat. And it means the past doesn't stop mattering just because we've learned to phrase things politely. The resurrection men disappeared quietly. No monuments, no apologies. Their work simply became illegal, unnecessary, and deeply unfashionable. And society moved on. Graveyards became places of peace again, mostly. Medical schools stopped pretending they didn't need bodies. They just found ways to get them without waking anyone up at night. And the dead, as always, adapted to the roles the living assigned them: teachers, warnings, foundations. This story doesn't end with justice or closure. It ends with normalization, with systems replacing shovels, with paperwork replacing secrecy, with a shared agreement not to look too closely at how we got here.
which in its own quiet way makes the resurrection men immortal, not as individuals, but as a reminder that even the calmest, cleanest institutions are often built on very muddy ground.
Because we're drifting back to the Victorian era, a time when everyone looked elegant, smelled faintly of coal smoke, and was constantly on the verge of passing out, for reasons that were not exactly romantic. You've probably heard the idea before. Victorian women fainted all the time. They were delicate, they wore tight corsets, their bodies simply could not handle the emotional strain of existing near furniture or strong opinions. And sure, that's the version that survived in cartoons and costume dramas. But the real story is much slower, much darker, and honestly far more mundane. Because most Victorian fainting was not about corsets. It was about carbon monoxide. And nobody noticed for decades. Because everyone was already tired, pale, underfed, overdressed, emotionally repressed, and inhaling poison indoors as a lifestyle choice. So let's ease into it. Picture a respectable Victorian sitting room. Heavy curtains, thick carpets, upholstery designed to absorb not just sound, but despair. The windows are closed, of course. Fresh air was considered dangerous. Drafts caused illness. Sunlight faded furniture and encouraged moral looseness. In the center of the room is a fireplace or coal stove. It is always burning, day and night, winter and summer, because a cold house was considered worse than a dead one. Coal is the fuel of the empire. Coal heats the home. Coal powers factories. Coal fills the lungs of the nation with pride and particulate matter. And when coal burns incompletely, which it does constantly in enclosed spaces, it releases carbon monoxide, an odorless, colorless gas. No drama, no warning, just a gentle replacement of oxygen in the bloodstream. You don't choke, you don't panic, you simply become tired, then dizzy, then confused, then, if you're lucky, horizontal. Which brings us to the fainting couch. Victorians did not faint because they were fragile flowers. They fainted because their blood cells were quietly being evicted from their own jobs. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin about 200 times more readily than oxygen. Once it's there, oxygen doesn't stand a chance. Your organs are technically alive, but no longer supplied properly. So the symptoms appear subtle at first. Headaches, nausea, a strange heaviness, mood changes, irritability, which Victorian doctors diagnosed as hysteria. Of course they did. Women were told their fainting spells were emotional or uterine or related to imagination. Men were told they were overworked, stressed, or victims of brain fatigue. Children were told nothing. They were simply pale, sickly, and destined to die young, which, statistically speaking, many of them were. Now let's talk about corsets. Because yes, they were uncomfortable. Yes, some were tight. Yes, extreme tight lacing existed, but the average corset worn by a middle-class Victorian woman was not a medieval torture device. It functioned more like structured underwear. Supportive, restrictive, sure, but not typically enough to cause spontaneous collapse in a well-oxygenated room. The real issue was that the room was not well-oxygenated at all. Imagine wearing layers of clothing, long skirts, petticoats, corset, chemise, stockings, sleeves, high collars. Now imagine doing this while your brain is running on fumes. Of course someone fainted. Honestly, it's impressive anyone stayed upright. Victorian cities made this worse. London was essentially a soup, coal smoke mixed with fog, sewage, and ambition. Indoor air was rarely refreshed. Fireplaces pulled oxygen from the room and replaced it with combustion byproducts. Gaslighting, which became wildly popular, added even more carbon monoxide into enclosed spaces. Gas lamps were considered modern and luxurious. They were also quietly lethal. A single gas lamp could leak enough carbon monoxide to make a room hazardous. Multiple lamps, combined with a stove, fireplace, and closed windows, turned living rooms into polite suffocation chambers. But nobody called it that. They called it the vapors. The vapors were blamed for everything: fainting, melancholy, weak nerves, sudden death in bed. The solution was often rest, or smelling salts, or a change of scenery, never, interestingly, fresh air. Victorian doctors did not yet understand carbon monoxide poisoning as a household threat. They knew miners died from bad air. They knew chimney sweeps collapsed in flues. But the idea that respectable parlors could be dangerous was uncomfortable. So, instead, the fainting continued. Women were advised to loosen their corsets. Men were advised to avoid excess thinking. Children were advised to be less frail, somehow. And the fainting couch became a permanent fixture, not as a medical device, but as furniture, a socially acceptable place to lie down when the room started spinning. Victorian etiquette manuals even addressed fainting: how to fall gracefully, how to revive someone properly, how not to embarrass yourself while your blood chemistry malfunctioned. Smelling salts were ammonia. They irritated the nasal passages, triggering a reflex inhale. This forced oxygen into the lungs, temporarily overcoming the carbon monoxide. It worked, briefly, and because it worked, no one questioned the cause. There's something deeply Victorian about that. Solve the symptom, ignore the system.
Carbon monoxide poisoning doesn't always kill quickly. Low-level exposure causes chronic illness, memory problems, depression, fatigue, irritability, which coincidentally describes much of Victorian literature. People wrote about ghosts, madness, oppressive interiors, unexplained dread. They were not haunted, they were hypoxic. Servants suffered the worst. They worked closest to the fires. They slept in basements and attics with poor ventilation. They rose early to light stoves and retired late after extinguishing lamps. Many servants were described as dull, slow, or accident-prone. They were blamed for their own symptoms. In reality, they were being slowly poisoned by the houses they maintained. Entire families would experience vague illness together. Doctors would attribute it to heredity, or moral weakness, or bad humors. If one person died suddenly, it was tragedy. If several did, it was misfortune. Rarely was it architecture. Even Queen Victoria herself suffered frequent headaches, fatigue, and bouts of melancholy. Her homes were filled with fires, gaslights, and heavy drapery. She famously preferred warm rooms, very warm rooms. No one suggested opening a window. It wasn't until the late 19th century that carbon monoxide began to be understood as a domestic threat. Industrial studies, accidents, patterns that became harder to ignore. People noticed that symptoms improved when families left the city, or moved houses, or stopped using certain stoves. Ventilation slowly became a concept, not a fashionable one, but a necessary one. Windows grew larger, fireplaces improved, gas fittings became safer, and mysteriously, fainting declined. Women did not suddenly become sturdier, men did not stop overthinking, children did not magically develop stronger constitutions, they simply got more oxygen. Which brings us back to corsets. Corsets were an easy target. They were visible, they were female, they fit the narrative of fragile womanhood. Carbon monoxide was invisible, genderless, and inconvenient. So history chose the corset. Even today, you'll hear that Victorian women fainted because they were tightly laced and emotionally overwhelmed. It's neat, it's tidy, it's wrong. The truth is slower, less dramatic, more lethal. People fainted because their environment was quietly hostile, because comfort and cleanliness were prioritized over airflow, because coal built the empire and poisoned its living rooms, and because medical understanding always lags behind architecture. As the Victorian era waned, fainting became less fashionable, less common, less expected. The fainting couch faded into obscurity, not because people became stronger, but because the air stopped trying to kill them. So the next time you picture a Victorian woman swooning delicately into someone's arms, imagine instead a room thick with invisible gas, a fire burning cheerfully, windows sealed tight against the immoral breeze, and a body doing the only reasonable thing it can do under the circumstances, lying down.
Let's drift forward next time into how entire royal households lived like this for generations and somehow blamed each other. All right, settle back in, adjust the pillow. Nothing dramatic is about to happen. Just generations of people quietly losing brain cells indoors. By the mid-Victorian period, carbon monoxide wasn't just a personal inconvenience, it was a group activity. Whole households experienced the same symptoms at the same time, which should have been a clue, but instead it became a family trait. Doctors loved heredity. Heredity explained everything without requiring anyone to redesign a stove. If a mother fainted and her daughter did too, clearly it was genetics, not the identical sitting room. If a father developed headaches, confusion, and irritability, and his sons later did the same, this was temperament, not the gas lamps hissing softly overhead. Victorian homes were designed to trap air. Heavy wallpaper, thick curtains, carpets layered on carpets, fireplaces that pulled oxygen out but didn't always vent properly. This was considered cozy. Fresh air was associated with factories, street noise, disease, and poverty. A sealed home meant refinement, and refinement, as always, came with consequences. Upper-class families suffered in quieter ways, lower-class families suffered faster. In cramped tenements, coal stoves burned in single rooms where entire families slept. Children woke with headaches, parents woke exhausted. Some didn't wake at all. These deaths were rarely labeled poisoning, they were called found dead in bed, a phrase doing a lot of work. Gaslighting made things worse. By the 40s and 50s, gas lamps spread rapidly through cities. They were brighter than candles, cleaner supposedly, and extremely leaky. Gas pipes ran through walls and ceilings, joints loosened, valves failed, tiny leaks were constant. People complained of dizziness near lamps, so manufacturers improved the light output, naturally. Bedrooms became particularly dangerous during the Victorian era. People slept with lamps burning all night, windows firmly closed, and curtains tightly drawn. As they slept, carbon monoxide accumulated silently in the air. No one noticed it, no one stirred. People simply sank deeper into unconsciousness. Victorians often described waking with what they called confusion of the mind, poor memory, mood swings, and a strange sense of unreality. These symptoms were blamed on bad dreams, weak nerves, or moral failure. Medical journals of the time are filled with case studies that come remarkably close to identifying the real problem, only to politely look away at the final moment. Doctors observed strange patterns. Servants in certain houses fell ill more often. Symptoms improved when families traveled. People recovered after fireplaces or gas fixtures were removed. And yet the official conclusions were rarely decisive. Illness was blamed on dampness, poor character, or vague constitutional weakness. Carbon monoxide poisoning was already well understood in mines, where miners collapsed, animals died first, and canaries famously dropped from their perches. But domestic poisoning did not look dramatic enough. It looked like tired people being tired, which fit Victorian expectations perfectly. Children were especially vulnerable. Their developing brains suffered more from constant exposure. Many Victorian children were described as slow learners, inattentive, weak, or mentally dull. Education manuals recommended stricter discipline, less imagination, and more structure. No one suggested ventilation. Some children developed permanent neurological damage, including memory loss, behavioral problems, and seizures. Families accepted this as fate, punishment, or simply how the child is. This fed directly into another Victorian obsession, degeneration. Victorians feared that humanity itself was declining, becoming weaker, stupider, and more unstable. They wrote books about it, debated it endlessly, and blamed modern life. In an accidental way, they were right. Modern life was poisoning them, slowly, politely, and elegantly, behind lace curtains. Royal households were not immune. In many ways, they were worse. Palaces were massive enclosed spaces filled with endless fireplaces and gas chandeliers, designed with poor ventilation by intention. Royal apartments were notoriously overheated because kings and queens preferred warmth, and servants complied. Courtiers complained of headaches and exhaustion, which were interpreted as boredom or political indifference. Several European royals in the 19th century experienced mysterious declines marked by cognitive lapses, sudden illnesses, and periods of confusion. These were blamed on stress, divine will, or inbreeding. Inbreeding certainly did not help, but breathing poison every day did not help either. One particularly revealing pattern was how symptoms clustered around specific rooms. Bedrooms, studies, and sitting rooms used heavily during winter caused the worst effects. People consistently felt better outdoors, in gardens, on balconies, or while traveling. Victorians loved seaside retreats, mountain air, and fresh air cures. They returned home refreshed and promptly shut the windows again. Even when carbon monoxide poisoning was suspected, responses were cautious. Removing gaslighting felt regressive. Opening windows felt dangerous. Changing stoves cost money. It was easier to prescribe rest. Rest cures became extremely popular, especially for women. These involved confinement indoors, dark rooms, and no stimulation, which tragically increased exposure. Women undergoing rest cures often reported worsening symptoms such as headaches, depression, and hallucinations. These were diagnosed as hysteria. Carbon monoxide also affects mood. It increases anxiety, irritability, and emotional instability. Victorian society was famously anxious, obsessed with propriety, terrified of scandal, and deeply uncomfortable with emotion. People snapped at each other, wrote passive-aggressive letters, and held grudges for decades. Some of this was cultural, some of it was neurological. Entire social norms were shaped by people with chronic headaches. Literature reflects this reality. Characters wander through foggy cities, struggle with memory, and experience inexplicable dread indoors. Authors were not exaggerating. They were documenting lived experience. By the late 19th century, accidental gas deaths became more visible. Newspapers reported families found unconscious and servants discovered collapsed. Investigations increasingly traced these incidents to faulty stoves or lamps. Public awareness grew slowly. Manufacturers improved ventilation. Chimneys were redesigned. Gas meters became safer, and fainting gradually declined. Doctors quietly stopped seeing as many cases of unexplained weakness, mental fog, and household illness. There was no announcement, no grand realization, just a slow improvement as architecture caught up with biology. Interestingly, corsets remained common for some time. Women did not suddenly begin fainting again once air quality improved, which should have settled the debate. But myths are comforting. The corset myth allowed society to blame women. Carbon monoxide required society to blame itself. So the myth survived. Today, Victorians are still imagined as delicate, melodramatic fainting figures, rather than people trapped in poorly ventilated rooms burning fuel indoors. They were not weak, they were doing their best. Invisible poisons shaped entire generations, influencing behavior, memory, and even politics. By the very end of the Victorian era, something subtle happened. People stopped fainting as often. Not completely, but the expected, socially rehearsed swoon faded away. Gaslighting became safer. Electric lighting quietly replaced open flames. Coal stoves improved. Chimneys were redesigned. Ventilation became respectable. Windows were allowed to open. Public health shifted, not out of sudden compassion, but because patterns became undeniable. Medical language changed as well. Hysteria began its slow retreat, not disappearing, but losing confidence. The fainting couch became decorative rather than necessary. Corsets continued into the early 20th century, yet fainting did not return. Again, the evidence was clear, but myths aged better than facts. Victorian women were portrayed as weak for generations. Their illnesses were dismissed and minimized. Many of them were genuinely sick, not emotionally overwhelmed, but neurologically impaired by poor air. Men suffered too. Victorian men were famously irritable, exhausted, and emotionally withdrawn. This was framed as leadership burden or intellectual strain, but often it was hypoxia. Entire political decisions were made by people with chronic headaches. Children raised in these environments carried the effects forward. Learning difficulties, behavioral problems, shortened lifespans. These were blamed on character, bloodlines, or destiny. Even as science advanced, the domestic sphere lagged behind. Factories were regulated before bedrooms. Workplaces were studied before living rooms. Comfort was considered personal, and personal suffering remained private. Carbon monoxide detectors would not become standard until the late 20th century, a full century after Victorians spent their evenings breathing themselves toward unconsciousness. The fainting era ended not with drama, but with silence. People stopped fainting. Doctors stopped writing about it. Furniture changed. History moved on. Looking back, the truth is quieter and sadder. People trusted their environment, their experts, and their traditions, and their bodies paid the price. It was not stupidity or weakness. It was simply living at the edge of knowledge. Every era has its invisible problems, its unseen poisons, and its comforting myths. The Victorians deserve a little grace. They were not dramatic fainting machines. They were tired people living in rooms that betrayed them.